So let's talk about these animation principles that we're going to be covering in this class. I've set up this project as an exercise that I'm going to teach you these animation principles through, but also for you to practice yourself. So you can either watch me as I do this and then practice yourself, or you can download the project file now under the Project and Resources tab so that you can follow along as you're watching. But what we're going to do in this exercise is just have this box right here travel from one side to the other side of our composition. And we're going to see just how exciting we can make that. It's a pretty linear movement. It's not a particularly complex animation, but as we stack on these different techniques using animation principles, you'll see how we can really give a lot of life to something as simple as a box. So first of all, let me center that back up. And the first thing I want to do is make the center of my composition the origin of the composition. Currently, it's in the top left corner. That's how After Effects measures its pixel grid, from the top left corner. So this is 0, 0, and the center is 960 by 540, since this is a 1920 by 1080 comp. So if I press P to bring up my position property for this layer, you can see that it's 960 by 620 actually, because I don't have this right in the center. If I turn on my title action safe guides, you can see that I dropped this down a little bit. But I want this to be a position value of 0 on the X. I don't really care about the Y because that's where I want it. But a really quick and easy way to do this, and a technique that I use a lot when I want to place the origin somewhere other than the top left corner of the comp, is to create a null object and parent this object to it. So I'm going to go up to Layer, New, Null Object. And this is just an empty layer that doesn't render. It just allows you to parent things to it and control other things. But I want this null to be in the exact same position as the box. So I'm going to grab the position property, copy with Control or Command C, paste with Control or Command V, and now it's in the exact same spot. If I press P on the keyboard again, we can see same position value. Now all I need to do is parent the box layer to the null object, and you can see that my position values are now 0, 0 because they are now in relationship to the parent. So the box's position in relationship to the null is 0. That's literally all I needed that null for, so I'm just going to rename it 0. I'm going to lock it. I'm going to hide it so I don't see it in my composition, and I'm going to shy it. And I already had the shy switch enabled because I'm hiding some of the other layers that make up the background, but that's why it just disappeared when I clicked on the shy switch. All right, let me turn that title and action safe guide back off, and we're left with the box. But with that parent relationship set up, I now have an origin of 0, 0, which means that I can know exactly how far to the left and right of the center of that comp I'm moving it. So I can just say, move this negative 400 pixels to the left, or move it positive 400 pixels to the right, and it'll be equal distance from the center. I use that trick all the time when I want these nice position values in relationship to the layer. The next thing I want to do is separate the dimensions of my position property. So I'm going to right click on it and say separate dimensions, and that gives me individual controls for the X and Y position. That allows me to use the value graph in my graph editor a lot easier than it would be if they were still combined. I don't always use the value graph, but in this case I'm only animating the X position, and I think the value graph is just going to make more sense visually for this animation. So let's start at just go to 1 second maybe, and I'll back this up to, let's say, around negative 500 pixels. Okay, I'm gonna set a keyframe on that X position and then go forward 1 second to 2 seconds and change this to 500. Now I'm working at 24 frames per second. If you're using this project file, then it's already set up for you, but just so you know, this is a 24 frames per second animation. So let me play this back. You can see it's very boring. Obviously these keys have no easing, but it's just traveling from one side to the other. So what's the first thing we could do to make it better? Well, first let me just rename this box 1, and then I'll duplicate it so that we have a little paper trail of where we were at the beginning. So box 2, I'm gonna press U to bring up the keyframes. Naturally, the first thing you probably think of is to ease these keyframes with easy ease. So I'm going to select those keyframes, press the F9 key on the keyboard, and now they are eased. Let's play that back, and you can see that it is better. It's easing in and out, but it's a very standard slight ease. It's the default easy ease, so it's not all that interesting. Still pretty basic. So if we go into the graph editor with those keyframes selected, and let me clean this up. I'll turn off my expression editor and then give myself a little more room in this graph. Now we can see our graph a little bit better, and if you're not familiar with the value graph, this is just a representation of the value over time. So at this point in time, the first keyframe, it's at negative 500 pixels. At this point in time, it's at positive 500 pixels. And this curve is the value over time between it. You can learn all about the graph editor in my other class, Animating with Ease, so definitely check that out if you haven't already. But what I can do here is make my ease just a little bit more dramatic and a little bit more stylized. So I'm gonna pull the handle out while holding shift so that it snaps to that baseline, and just drag that influence out a little bit on the outgoing keyframe and in quite a bit on the incoming keyframe. So let's see what that looks like. Now it's just a much better looking ease. It has more speed in the middle, it eases in and out a lot more smoothly, and it's just generally more pleasing to look at. So far, it all seems pretty basic, but this is actually one of the principles of animation. We've already touched on it, which is slow in and slow out, which another way to say that is ease in and ease out. Basically, it's moving faster in the middle of the animation than it is on either side, and it just makes for a more pleasing to look at animation. But what can we do to make this better? Well, let's duplicate this layer again, turn off the second copy, and talk about what we can do next. We close up this layer and press U on this one to bring up the position keyframes. And the first animation principle we're going to talk about is called anticipation. Anticipation is basically giving the viewer a visual cue as to what's about to happen so that they're able to anticipate what you're going to do with your motion. And we can do that really easily in our animation. So what we'll do is just back up maybe 5 frames. I'll press page up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times and set a keyframe. And going back to this keyframe right here, what I want to do is just back this up a little bit on the X position. And looks like I forgot to turn box 2 off, so let me disable that. But we'll move it back just maybe negative 525. So 25 pixels, it's traveling in the opposite direction before it goes forward. So if I play this back, you can see it just shifts backward a little bit, anticipating the movement that's about to happen across the screen. Anticipation is as simple as that, but it can be an extremely effective way to give the viewer cues as to what's about to happen. And like all of the principles of animation, it's there to make the movement you're creating more desirable. So let's again go into the value graph, and I'm going to zoom in here so we can see it a little bit better. So right here between the first 2 keyframes, I don't really have much of an S-curve. So I'm just gonna pull this out a little bit, coming out of that first keyframe, and then pull it out a little bit more going into the next keyframe, and we'll play that back. So now it's a little bit sharper of a movement going back and then forward. Okay, so that's looking really good. Now we have anticipation in this movement. Well, we can make this even a little bit more interesting to look at by adding in something that goes along with anticipation really well, which is follow through. So let me duplicate this, hide this layer, and then we'll bring up the position values for this. And we're going to do the exact same thing in the opposite direction. So anticipation happens before the big movement, and follow through happens after the big movement. So let's go 5 frames after this last keyframe, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the page down key, and set another keyframe. And then go back to this one, and we're going to add 25 pixels to it, just like before in the opposite direction. So we'll say 525. And now it's going to go past that final resting spot before coming back to it. So let's play that back. And now we have some anticipation and some follow through. Now let's go back into the graph editor and just clean this up a little bit. So I'm going to zoom in with the plus key and scroll down so I can see the curve a little bit better. And we'll adjust these handles again and take a look at how that moves. So we've got a snappy in and snappy out animation. This might be a little bit too tight. Maybe we need to ease more into that last frame a little bit better. Okay, and now maybe on this big movement, the curve needs to be adjusted just a little bit so it's not slowing down quite so much before that follow through. So I'm gonna just drag this back a little, maybe tighten the out a little bit, and we'll see what that looks like. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So with just a couple of extra keyframes, we've added both anticipation and follow through to this simple animation, and it's giving it a lot more life. But we can take this anticipation and follow through even one more step further using another property other than just position. So let's duplicate this, fold that up and hide it. And on this one, I want to include rotation as well. But I need to rotate it from 2 specific points on my box. I don't want to rotate it around the center where the anchor point is. I want to do it on the bottom left corner and the bottom right corner. So this is another technique that I use all the time when I need to rotate or distort something or transform from a different point than the anchor point of the layer itself. We do this through an effect called transform. And you'll notice I don't have my effects and presets panel open, and that's because I want to show you my real world workflow. There's a free plugin from Video Copilot called FX Console, and you can find the download link in the notes of this video right now. But what it allows you to do is with a keyboard shortcut, I'm on a PC, so it's Control Space, pop up a search bar right here that allows you to search everything that would be in your effects and controls panel. So very quickly, you just press the hotkey, and then you can search for anything you want. So I want the transform effect, there it is. Just press enter and it's applied to the layer I had selected. So here are all the transform controls that are exactly the same as what you have inside of your layer transform controls, but it also gives you the ability to skew and some other controls, so it's a very useful effect. I use it all the time. Now by default, it puts the anchor point right in the center of your layer, just like a normal layer would. But if I try to move that anchor point, you see that the layer contents are shifting within it. So what we need to do is actually tie the position to the anchor point. So wherever the anchor point goes, the position value follows it. This is extremely easy to do. I'm just going to double click on the anchor point value and that will bring it up down here in my layers. I have my anchor point and position right here. All I need to do is grab my property pick whip, click and drag to the anchor point, and After Effects will tie this value to this value via an expression that it writes itself. You don't need to know what that expression is or how to write it. Just use that property pick whip, and now wherever the anchor point goes, the position value goes with it. So I can put my anchor point wherever I need to, and it will always appear correct. So what I want to do is put this in the bottom left corner, and I want to be pretty precise with this. So if I take a look at the values, the anchor point is almost at 150 by 350, and I know that this pre-comp is a perfect 500 by 500 square, so I can know that these should be round numbers. So I'm going to say 150 by 350, and there we go. My anchor point is in the bottom left corner of the box. Now I can grab the rotation property and rotate it on that corner. That's exactly what I need to do. So I'm going to set a keyframe on the rotation, press U so I'm just seeing the keyframes, and then we're going to align this with our anticipation keyframes and our follow through keyframes. So let's start with the anticipation. I want to move this keyframe back to here and then go forward, and on this anticipation, I'm going to rotate this back just a little bit. It doesn't need to be all that much, but now it's going to slide back as well as tip back before moving forward. And I'm going to need to set another keyframe maybe right about here where it comes back down before it does that big slide. So let's set that rotation down to 0 and then easy ease all of these keyframes, F9 on the keyboard, go into the graph editor and just make that a little bit nicer of a curve. So we'll tighten this one out a little bit, and this one can actually come down pretty hard. It can stay up in the air longer and then kind of slap down there. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, not bad. Let me zoom out so we can see the whole animation, and we'll play that again. So this is working out okay, but because we're incorporating that other property, we can actually modify our animation a little bit. I don't think that we need the X position, anticipation, or follow through anymore. So I'm just going to delete those 2 outer keyframes, and we're just going to use that rotation as our anticipation and follow through. So let's see what that looks like now. Okay, so it is a little off. Let's take a look at why. Let's zoom in here and play this back. And the reason it's a little bit off is because it's really slowly easing out of this position value. And that's what we wanted before, but now we kind of want it to just take off as soon as it slaps back down, right? So let me move these rotation keyframes back so that it hits the ground right here on this keyframe. And that's when we want it to take off. And then I'll go into my position value, into the value graph, and instead of easing out of this really slowly, I'm going to pick this up so it's not perfectly flat, and hopefully that will help it take off a little bit quicker. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing on this end. I'm going to pull that down, and we'll see if we can finesse this a little bit to make it just look a little bit more believable. Okay, so we're getting there, but now I think that this animation is just taking too long. So let's back this keyframe up a little bit. And now we're getting somewhere. So let's play that again. Okay, so we're getting there. I think I'm gonna stretch this out just a little bit more so that it starts to move before it gets all the way down to the ground. Okay, we're almost there. I'm gonna scoot these forward 1 frame and then maybe adjust my easing so it's a little bit more eased out of there. And we'll bring this up to be a little more symmetrical. And that's a little too extreme. There we go. There we go, that's looking a lot better. So it really takes off as it slaps down. And maybe that easing is a little bit too strong right here on my rotation, so I'll just back that up a little bit. There we go. So now we've got a little bit of that anticipation, and maybe it could even rotate back just a couple more degrees. So maybe around 14 degrees backwards. And maybe I'll just slow that anticipation a little bit by backing up that first keyframe. There we go. So now we've got that visual cue of the rotation indicating that some motion is about to happen. It's kind of revving up, getting ready to move across the screen. Great. So how do we apply that same principle to our follow through? Well, we're basically gonna mirror that movement on the opposite end as it starts to slow down. So maybe just a couple frames before this keyframe, we'll set another rotation value. But the problem is it's still going to rotate off of that back left corner. So we need to move that anchor point over here. But if I do that, if I just click and drag, then this rotation animation is broken. So I'll undo that, and we need to do one more thing before we start animating this corner, which is set a keyframe on the anchor point. So I'll just click once on that stopwatch to set the keyframe, press U to bring that keyframe up, and I want to make this a hold keyframe. So if I right click on that keyframe, and this is at the bottom of the screen recording, but it says toggle hold keyframe, just click on that, and now this is a value that will not change until it reaches another keyframe. So I'm just going to back this up to the start of the animation. And now I can change this value to something else. So I'm gonna move it over to this corner, and that should be a 350 value. And now if we zoom in here, you can see it's on the bottom right corner, and if I go back 1 frame, it snaps back to that left corner. So it's going to stay there until I need it to be on the opposite side. Then I'll just go forward a few frames, and we'll rotate it in the opposite direction. Again, we'll go 14 degrees, and then back down to 0. So let's take a look at our value graph. We obviously need to curve that out a little bit more. So I'm going to just drag these handles out. I'm holding down Alt or Option on a Mac to click and drag those handles out. And just make this a little bit nicer. So this can slap down a little bit. Hold on or hug that keyframe right there, that value, and see what that looks like. Okay, not bad. I think I can make it even tighter. And now it's really just shooting in here and taking off. Maybe this doesn't need to ease quite so much. Yeah, there we go. Maybe back this off 1 or 2 frames. Yeah, that looks really good. So let's zoom out and look at that as a whole. Play that all back. And now we've got our anticipation and follow through being completed using rotation instead of that position value. I think it could lift off the ground even a little bit more quickly right here. So I'm gonna go back into that value graph and just pick that up. Yeah, now it really looks like it's kind of stopping on a dime. And I think the exposition easing, that is happening a little bit too strongly, so I'm gonna pull that back a little bit. And now we have a slightly more linear movement between the start and the end of the animation, but that anticipation and follow through are really selling that movement.